War on Brown Water, Naval War of 1812 Illustrated. A production of the American Society of Marine Artists. War on Brown Water. Part 4. Soon after the war started, the main theater of naval activity began moving from the blue waters of the oceans to the brown waters of American bays, sounds, estuaries, and rivers. This was not by American choice, but dictated by British strategy and might, and was made possible by a favorable turn of events in the Napoleonic Wars. Never fully recovering from the disastrous invasion of Russia in 1812, the French suffered another major defeat in October 1813 at the Battle of Leipzig in Saxony, present-day Germany. This forced Napoleon's retreat back to France and his eventual abdication in the spring of 1814, and freed up military assets for the British to redeploy to the American theater of war. In response to the initial success of the American Navy and privateers during 1812, the Admiralty ordered its frigates not to engage with American frigates on a one-to-one basis, and it began to institute more stringent convoy requirements in order to protect British commerce from both the U.S. Navy and American privateers. The British knew from the beginning that the most effective way to deal with the Americans was to bottle up their navy and merchantmen by blockading them in port. This would not only eliminate more embarrassing naval victories, but, more to the point, begin to strangle commerce and the economy, and, importantly, cut off funding of the American government that came principally from tariffs on trade. While shipping is still a key part of modern-day transportation, a fact not appreciated because most people do not see ships, only trucks, trains, and planes, in the early 19th century, coastal river and ocean shipping was how goods moved. Only later did roads, canals, and railroads appear on the American landscape. Following the October 1813 victory over Napoleon at Leipzig, the British began to divert ships and seasoned troops to establish a stranglehold on America. The growing death grip can be appreciated by looking through the tightening noose of the blockade they began to establish in 1813 and follow it to the devastation wrought on brown waters to American seaports and shipping by the summer of 1814. As an instrument of policy, the British blockade was far more than a heavy-handed way to deal with America. They appreciated very well the enormous American political division over the war, and the fact that those who lived in the Atlantic coastal states and who favored the war were found in the mid-Atlantic and southern states, while the anti-war Federalists were in shipping and commerce-oriented New England. Thus, in the spring of 1813, when the British first proclaimed the blockade, it was against the Delaware and Chesapeake Bays. The proclamation of a blockade was a recognized legal action that all parties of that time understood. Interestingly, a formal blockade required that the proclaiming party had to have the wherewithal to enforce and maintain it. As the British were able to direct more and more military assets to deal with the Americans, they could and did broaden the blockade up and down the American coast. Later that spring of 1813, they expanded it to major ports in other mid-Atlantic and southern states, and in November of that year, they added the remaining ports in the south and included Long Island Sound in the north. During that same year, the British issued from their main North American naval headquarters in Halifax, Nova Scotia, licenses to New England merchants to ship American grain and foodstuffs to General Wellington, who was engaged with the French in the Iberian Peninsula. This served two purposes for the British. It fed its army, and it supported economically those against the war in America. But as the war in Europe came to an end in the spring of 1814, the British extended the proclamation to include New England, and the nature of the blockade changed from that of 1813, where limited resources were focused on stopping and confiscating shipping in American ports, to a much more aggressive war effort in 1814. The noose of the 1813 blockade was very different from the death grip of 1814. Blockades did not just stop shipping. They required resources to be maintained, food and materials for the hundreds or thousands of sailors, Marines, and stationed troops.
Where possible and politic, the British were willing to buy these goods, and on many occasions the commerce-starved Americans were willing sellers. Some even used the guise of a neutral flag to facilitate such trade. In fact, there was so much commerce going on, largely with the enemy, the Madison administration was able to convince Congress to pass an embargo of all American ships in port and all exports in late 1813. This, of course, only brought more economic hardship and further reduced government revenues. It was suicidal and was repealed at Madison's request only 4 months later. But later in 1814, the noose tightened as the British presence grew, and they began to use force more openly to destroy shipping, seaport towns, and facilities. No longer a simple blockade, the war involved forceful occupation, destruction, and even plunder. Many communities suffered, but a closer look at 3 theaters along the Atlantic coast demonstrates the nature of this brown water warfare: Long Island Sound, the eastern coast of Maine, and the Chesapeake Bay. Long Island Sound. The U.S. frigates United States and Macedonia spent the winter of 1812 and 1813 in New York City, undergoing repairs and restocking. They were ready to return to sea by May 1813, but were blockaded by the British patrolling south of the city at the Sandy Hook entrance. So Captain Stephen Decatur and his squadron, the United States Macedonian Hornet, sailed north through Hell's Gate on the East River to gain access to Long Island Sound and the open ocean. Aside from a bolt of lightning that struck the mainmast of the United States and rattled its crew, all went well until they reached the eastern end of the Sound, where they encountered a squadron of British ships blockading the Sound. So they retreated to New London Harbor on the eastern end of the Connecticut coast. That was the 1st of June. The frigates would be there until the end of the war, more than a year and a half later. The formal blockade of Long Island Sound would be proclaimed later that year, but it was obviously already in effect during the summer of 1813. Patrolling the Sound to make sure the Decatur squadron did not escape was the HMS Romilly's 74 under Captain Thomas Masterman Hardy, the highly respected seasoned Royal Navy officer of Kiss Me Hardy fame. This was the dying command of Admiral Nelson to Captain Hardy as he lay on the deck of his flagship, the HMS Victory 100, that Hardy captained at Trafalgar. The HMS frigate Orpheus 38 under Sir Hugh Pigot accompanied the Romillys. During the beginning months of patrolling the Sound, Captain Hardy struck a successful balance between civility and hostility to the Americans. However, as time passed and more shipping was captured on the Sound, and the Americans became increasingly concerned about raids on their towns, ships, and marine facilities, local volunteer militias formed up and defense plans were made to deal with attacks. The big ships drew too much water to get close to most harbors and towns, but their boats, loaded with Marines and even cannon, could pursue commercial vessels trying to escape into harbors or up rivers, or could raid those anchored in the harbors and cut them out or burn them, destroy docks and buildings, pillage for provisions, etc. So local militia, armed with muskets and small field pieces, established watches and used church bells or other signals to assemble defenses quickly. This occurred frequently, day and night, at all times of the year. Lacking a naval force to take more aggressive measures, local citizens devised ingenious tactics to rid Long Island Sound of the British menace. This only heightened anxiety aboard the British ships and made the situation even more charged. The Eagle incident was a prime example of a baited trap. In the spring of 1813, some Americans took the merchant schooner Eagle and arranged a deck cargo of food and provisions that were very much in demand by the British fleet so as to make sure there was no doubt she was a regular cargo-carrying merchantman. In truth, below the flour barrels on the deck was a hold full of explosives and flammables, set to go off once the Eagle was captured, as it was, and once the American crew jumped ship, as they did, and once the Eagle was tied up next to the 74-gun Ramillies, which it was not. Rather, the cautious Hardy instructed the Eagle be moored next to another captured merchantman, an insightful move on his part, for the Eagle did blow, but took with it the merchantmen and several sailors, not the Romillies. Thereafter, Hardy took further precautions against this sort of attack by no longer allowing American small craft to come alongside his ships, as they had done customarily to sell fish, meats, vegetables, etc., etc. And then there was the attempt to sink the Romillies with a version of a submarine designed and used unsuccessfully during the Revolutionary War. It actually did get under the ship reportedly 3 times, but was unable to affix the explosive charge. Similarly, what would be called mines today were tried but to no avail. But all of this prompted Hardy to drag chains held on either side of his ships from the bow to the stern to check for attached munitions. Faced increasingly with these sort of annoyances, it was no wonder that Hardy was often found at the mouth of the Sound on Block Island, known to be friendly to the British and a source of fresh water and livestock, or with his friend John Gardner, who was pro-British and entertained ship's officers at his home on Gardner's Island, located between the 2 eastern forks of Long Island. Finally, when Hardy learned that the Americans planned to attack with a fleet of whaleboats acting as fire boats, he announced that if that happened, he would fire every house along the Sound. Nothing happened, but things were getting ugly.
The British demonstrated that they could play the game of roues de guerre. Captured fishing vessels were turned against unknowing merchantmen. The fishing vessel, loaded with sailors and marines hidden out of sight, would approach a merchantman in an innocent fashion, come alongside, and suddenly board and take her. Word soon spread, and it became difficult to repeat this particular roues de guerre on others. Another version, on a grander scale, involved painting the hull and bending old sails on a naval ship to make her look like an old merchantman, an attractive target for a privateer. Once the quarry was lured close enough, the veil would be lifted and tables turned in a flash of a broadside. One British ship that was part of the Hardy Squadron, the H.M. brig Borer, engaged in this roues de guerre as seen here. But the Borer is better remembered for the burning of the fleet at Essex, Connecticut in the spring of 1814. Located near the mouth of the Connecticut River, the town of Essex, formerly named Potopog, dates to the 17th century. At the time of the war, it was an active shipbuilding community and launched many fast vessels used in privateering. This is probably what attracted the British. In any case, under the cover of darkness on the night of April 7, 1814, Captain Richard Coote of the H.M. brig Borer led a flotilla of 6 shipboats carrying 136 Royal Marines 6 miles up the Connecticut River, and in the early hours of April 8th, systematically torched the ships at anchor and on the ways, but did not set fire to the town. By sunrise, they were retreating with 2 American privateers loaded with captured provisions, including a good deal of rum. But they grounded, and all the following day local militia fired on them. Eventually, the retreating British torched the ships and returned by their boats alone. 27 vessels were lost, valued at a sum thought to be the single largest economic loss of the war. Every year, the burning of the fleet is commemorated in Essex. Later that summer, there were more fireworks when Captain Thomas Masterman Hardy, acting under orders from Rear Admiral George Coburn to destroy towns along the New England coast, assembled a squadron of 5 ships, including his Romillies 74, the H.M. frigate Pactolus 44, the H.M. sloop of war Dispatch 22 and Nimrod 20, and the H.M. bomb ship Terror off the town of Stonington, Connecticut, located a few miles east of New London. Hardy then sent notice to the town that if the town did not surrender, in 1 hour the fleet would begin to bombard it. The townspeople replied they had no intention of surrendering and sent their women and children away to safety. After 3 days of impressive bombardment with cannon, mortars, and Congreve rockets, as in Rockets' Red Glare in the national anthem, the British withdrew, leaving 40 homes damaged and 4 destroyed, but no one killed. Every year on the 10th of August, the town celebrates the Battle of Stonington with parades and ceremonies.
Although the attacks on Stonington and Essex are better known today because of their annual commemorations, there were many other seaport towns in New England that to one degree or another were treated in a similar fashion by the British. During the spring of 1814, the captains and crews of the blockaded American frigates United States and the Macedonian were redeployed. Meanwhile, the ships were moved further up the Thames River for protection and placed in hulk, stripped of masts, cannon, etc., but still floating. Captain Decatur and his crew went overland to New York City to man the U.S. frigate President and wait for an opportunity to run the blockade to sail with a squadron to the East Indies, while Captain Jacob Jones of the U.S. frigate Macedonian and his crew went to the Great Lakes to serve with Commodore Chauncey. The Maine coast. At the time of the War of 1812, Maine was a part of Massachusetts. The northernmost part of Maine jutted north into British North America, what was then called Lower Canada, in a way that prevented any direct east-west overland route from Halifax or from St. John on the mainland to Quebec. If the eastern half of Maine were in the hands of the British, that problem would be eliminated and an ongoing dispute about the common border of that thinly populated area resolved. Moreover, by occupying that half of the Maine coast, the British would be in a better bargaining position in post-war peace negotiations. Accordingly, the British government ordered the governor of Nova Scotia, Sir John Sherbrooke, to take the eastern coast of Maine, from Eastport on Moose Island, the easternmost town in the United States, to Castine, on the eastern bank of the Penobscot River that enters the Atlantic halfway down the Maine coast. The operation began on July 11, 1814, when Captain Thomas Masterman Hardy transported 1,000 troops under Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Pilkington from Halifax to Eastport. Faced with an overwhelming force, the 85 soldiers of Fort Sullivan that defended Eastport surrendered, and the British established their eastern beachhead. The western one followed when Rear Admiral Edward Griffith, with a squadron of 8 ships, ferried 2,500 men under Sir John Sherbrooke to the small port town of Castine on September 1st. He then worked his way up the Penobscot River to Bangor and en route encountered the American captain Charles Morris, who burned his ship, the U.S. frigate Adams 28, to keep it out of the hands of the British. Subsequently, the British took the coastal port town of Machias, roughly halfway between Eastport and Castine. The Massachusetts militia, occupied with other more pressing problems, decided not to try to retake the coast, especially since it knew it would be virtually impossible without naval support, and whatever of that could be mustered would be significantly outgunned by the British fleet in nearby Halifax. So that part of Maine remained in British control until after the war, when all original borders were reinstated under the terms of the peace treaty. The Chesapeake Bay. As the War of 1812 began, the British were fully aware of their strategic vulnerability in Upper Canada, the lands north of New York, Pennsylvania, and Ohio. It was a remote wilderness and far from Britain's military strength, tied down in Europe and landlocked from the Royal Navy. The British decided to take some of the American pressure off the northern border in 1813 by using the assets it did have available, namely the Royal Navy, to cause the Americans to redirect their military attention. There were 2 natural targets. The Chesapeake Bay was an active commercial, agricultural, and trading area that also offered 2 important metropolitan targets, Baltimore and Washington, D.C., the capital, and the other was New Orleans, at the mouth of a river system that was critical to the survival of all Western America, where the population not only called for war with Britain, but also actively supported it in Canada by providing troops and supplies. Control of New Orleans would further the existing alliances of Native Americans who provided manpower that the British could ill afford from their European wars. As a southern city, it could also figure into another British strategy to weaken the American South, namely encourage a slave revolt. Slaves fleeing plantations could be recruited for military service in defending New Orleans, once taken. The British decided the Chesapeake was the greater priority and would have the greatest, most immediate effect on American efforts along the northern border. Thus, in the spring of 1813, Rear Admiral George Cockburn, who was in charge of the Chesapeake blockade and who was acting under orders of Admiral Sir John Borlace Warren, the commander of the North American station at Halifax, moved into the Chesapeake and sailed to the northern part of the bay. There, he destroyed a depot at Frenchtown on the Elk River, and as he sailed south past where the Susquehanna River empties into the bay, he was reportedly annoyed when he saw an American flag flying defiantly above a battery at the town of Havre de Grace. Protected by shallow waters and shoals, Cockburn could not bring his ships to attack the town, so under cover of darkness, he sent more than a dozen shipboats across the shoals to burn and sack the town on May 3rd, leaving 2/3 of it in ashes. There was no loss of life since the residents had fled. Americans were shocked, probably unaware their countrymen had torched Canadian towns just months before and had forced those residents out empty-handed into the dead of the Canadian winter. Cockburn continued his path of destruction up the Susquehanna River for a distance, burned buildings, and destroyed an important ironworks and cannon foundry at Principio. Admirals Warren and Cockburn then orchestrated an attack at the southern end of the bay on the Goatsport Navy Yard and Marine Base in Portsmouth. Blockaded in the bay, the U.S. frigate Constellation had taken safe harbor there, where the bay empties into the Atlantic, ready to run the blockade if propitious circumstances arose. The Navy Yard and Portsmouth are across the Elizabeth River from Norfolk, and all three are only accessible by water through a series of channels, mud flats, and an island where early seamen saw hundreds of cranes, actually they were herons, and named it Craney Island. Preparing for the attack, Brigadier General Robert B. Taylor, in charge of the Virginia militia in the area, blocked off the Elizabeth River and began fortifying Craney Island at the harbor entrance with a fort and redoubts manned by the militia with field artillery pieces from Portsmouth, but also Navy guns and 150 Navy sailors and Marines from the Constellation. The British arrived with a force rarely seen at that time: 3 74s, 1 64, 4 frigates, a number of troop ships, and several lesser vessels. Unable to get past the obstacles placed on the Elizabeth River, in the early morning of June 22nd, the British sent a force of a couple thousand to attack the island by land, and an amphibious force of 2,000, including 700 Royal Marines, to attack in 50 barges, led by the colorful 52-foot Centipede that mounted a brass cannon in its bow. The defenders did not open fire until the barges were well within range, and even though both sides of the island were attacked in the course of the battle, the defenders held their ground against this vastly superior force. The British retreated, but only after losing a number of their barges, 3 of which sunk in shallow water, and Constellation crewmen recovered, and suffered an estimated 200 casualties, half of which were killed. The Centipede and 22 of its crew were also captured. There were no American reported deaths in this successful defensive action. As if to vent their frustration, on June 26, the British attacked Hampton, a small port town located 5 miles to the north of Norfolk across the famous Hampton Roadstead roads. The defending militia was overwhelmed, and those citizens who remained witnessed every kind of destruction and violence: pillage, rape, murder, and the complete destruction of the town. It was all done with impunity. The British later argued that the corps of Frenchmen, the Chasseurs Britanniques, former British prisoners recruited from prison ships and who had reputations for violent ways, were responsible. The French corps was returned to Halifax, and subsequent attacks along the eastern shore in August, Kent Island, St. Michael's, Queenstown, proved far less destructive. Captain Joshua Barney, a colorful Revolutionary War hero, watched what the British were doing on the bay in 1813 and offered the U.S. Navy his service and an idea: to build a flotilla of gunboats especially designed for warfare on the Chesapeake, with its thousands of miles of coastline, hundreds of estuaries and creeks, and, in particular, its shallow waters and fickle winds. He dramatically presented this concept on July 4th, 1813. The Navy Secretary Jones accepted it, and the following spring, the Chesapeake Flotilla, otherwise known as Barney's Flotilla, was launched. By September 1813, the bulk of the British fleet withdrew to winter quarters in Bermuda, leaving the bay in peace, but still blockaded. Chesapeake Bay, 1814. During 1813, the Governor-in-Chief of British North America, Canada, asked those in charge of the operations against the Americans, Admiral Sir John Borlace Warren in Halifax and General Robert Ross in the Royal Navy Station in Bermuda, to deal with the Americans the same way the Americans dealt with the British in Canada when they burned York. The highly regarded General Ross arrived in Bermuda with 3,400 battle-proven troops from the European campaign in July 1814 and established their base of operation on Tangier Island in the middle of the southern part of the bay. One of the first naval engagements of the new season occurred on the 1st of June when Commodore Joshua Barney's newly launched flotilla of roughly 20 vessels met the HM schooner St. Lawrence 12 and ship's boats from two British 74s, the Dragon and the Albion. Barney had 7 75-foot sloop-rigged boats capable of being rowed, another 6 measuring 50 feet, and an assortment of other vessels, including Barney's flagship, the 49-foot U.S. gunboat Scorpion 4. In the Battle of St. Jerome Creek, Barney drove the surprised British back until they reached the safety of the 74s. The Americans then retired to the safety of the Patuxent River. When the British returned, they bottled up the Americans in a tributary feeding the river. With the eventual assistance of troops commanded by officers of the U.S. Army and U.S. Marines, Barney fought his way out in the Battle of St. Leonard's Creek and regained the open water of the Maine River, but, pursued by the British, had to retreat further up it while the British burned the town of St. Leonard. The Americans retreated upriver to Benedict, where the British bombarded the town and flotilla for several days. Barney was commanded to take his vessels further up to Queen Anne where, if the British pursued, he was instructed to burn his boats. This happened on August 22nd in the Battle of Queen Anne. Although one can question the success of Barney's flotilla, it is credited with 2 important accomplishments. It delayed the British attack on Washington and Baltimore because the main invasion route turned out to be the Patuxent River, and it was right on Barney's heels as he fought his slow retreat up the Patuxent River. And, more specifically, immediately following the destruction of his flotilla, Barney and the sailors and Marines of his flotilla joined in the defense of Washington at the Battle of Bladensburg on August 24th. With 2 18-pounder and 2 12-pounder naval cannon hastily brought up from the Navy Yard in Washington, they provided the only meaningful resistance in what was otherwise a rout by the British. What came to be known as the Bladensburg Races, the counterpart to the rout of British ships in the battle on Lake Ontario in 1813, known as the Burlington Races. Out of ammunition and vastly outnumbered, the sailors and Marines fought hand-to-hand combat and were the last to retreat from the battle. They then went north to defend Baltimore. General Ross continued to Washington after Bladensburg and, meeting little resistance, set about burning and looting the major public buildings, including the Senate and House wings of the Capitol building. The Center Dome section had yet to be built. The Library of Congress, the Treasury building, the War Department, and the White House. Meanwhile, the retreating Americans torched the Navy Yard and 2 new ships on the ways there, the U.S. frigate Columbia 44 and the U.S. brig Argus 18, named after the ship, whose impressive record ended a year before. A separate Royal Navy force attacked up the Potomac, took the rich seaport of Alexandria without a fight, and carried off great quantities of warehouse provisions, but did not torch the town. A violent storm with torrential rain checked the fire in Washington, and, a day after they arrived, the British withdrew and headed to Baltimore, where the Baltimore defenders were busy preparing for British land and sea attack. Baltimore is well protected from attack from the water by Fort McHenry at the entrance to Baltimore Harbor. The Americans sank a line of merchant vessels to further harbor defenses. The best land route for an army transported by ships to attack the city was through a long peninsula called North Point that extends several miles into the bay and offers protected harbors for easy disembarkation. The British had 5,000 troops to attack on land and its fleet of ships to attack by sea. Major General Samuel Smith of the Maryland Militia, in overall command of the forces defending Baltimore, sent Brigadier General John Stricker with 2,000 men to fortify, engage, and delay the oncoming British 5 miles from the city and thereby give the defenders more time to prepare. They dug in at a narrow neck of the peninsula while General Ross and 5,000 troops landed at North Point on September 12th. In the opening conflict, the British suffered a major loss when an American rifleman killed General Ross. This unexpected death of a man who had survived the trials of the Napoleonic Wars with honors rattled the British command. It was further weakened when it devolved onto a much less competent officer, Colonel Arthur Brooke. Nonetheless, the British pressed forward while, as anticipated, the Americans fell back from their defenses at North Point to Hampstead Hill, the major defensive line stretching 3 miles around the eastern side of Baltimore. The U.S. Navy Commodore John Rodgers oversaw its construction. It was much stronger than the British anticipated, with 100 cannon and 10,000 men under the overall command of U.S. Army Major General Samuel Smith. British attempts to bring naval firepower to bear were successfully frustrated by the guns at Fort McHenry, while an attempt to right flank the strong American line had been anticipated and was successfully thwarted. In the early morning hours of September 14th, the British viewed further pursuit as hopeless and ordered to retreat back to their ships. The Royal Navy brought a number of specialized ships to bombard Fort McHenry, including the rocket ship Erebus, specially designed to launch 32-pound Congreve rockets from a battery below deck through openings on the ship's side. Although highly inaccurate, their visible path, especially at night, coupled with their sound in flight, struck terror into those subjected to them. More devastating were the bomb ships that launched fused mortar shells meant to explode in or above defensive fortifications and redoubts. The British bomb ships Terror, Etna, Meteor, Volcano, and Devastation participated in the 24-hour-long bombardment of Fort McHenry. In spite of an impressive quantity of shells lobbed at the fort from a distance outside the range of the fort's guns, little damage was done and casualties were minimal. In spite of all the sophisticated hardware brought to the battle, it was a piece of cloth, a very large American flag measuring 42 feet by 30 feet, that had been sewn together by Mary Pickersgill and her 13-year-old daughter, that won the day, when it replaced the fort's riddled battle flag in the morning light of September 14th. The Baltimore lawyer Francis Scott Key was on board one of the British ships on a mercy mission under a flag of truce and witnessed the bombs bursting in air and the rocket's red glare, and immortalized this flag when he penned a poem that he put to the music of an Old English Bacchanalian song popular at the time in America. Its popularity grew over the subsequent generations, and in 1931, Congress adopted it as the national anthem. The Gulf Coast, the conclusion to the war. While the British were conducting their Chesapeake campaign in 1813 and 1814 in the remote hinterland known as the Mississippi Territory, land that is more or less present Mississippi and Alabama, a first-generation Scots-Irish self-made man, Andrew Jackson, was busy becoming a charismatic military leader who would soon assemble a motley mix of Americans of every stripe and color to stop the British cold and win one of the greatest battles of the war. Jackson was born in 1767, taken prisoner at 13 in the Revolutionary War, where he lost his 2 brothers, orphaned at 14, became a school teacher, lawyer, plantation and slave owner, U.S. representative and U.S. senator from the new state of Tennessee, and major general in the Tennessee militia. Jackson led the military response to the August 30th, 1813 attack and slaughter at Fort Mims, several miles north of Mobile, by a faction of the Creek Indians known as the Red Sticks. Inspired by calls from the great Native American chief Tecumseh in the Northwest to resist expanding settlements aggressively, the Red Sticks wiped out Fort Mims, slaughtering over 500, scalping half. Jackson mustered an army from the militias in that part of the country and, in what became known as the Creek War, eventually defeated the Red Sticks on March 27, 1814 at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, where over 800 Red Stick warriors were killed and more than 200 wounded. In the resulting Treaty of Fort Jackson, the Creeks turned over most of their territory, a process that would continue for years, until most had moved west of the Mississippi. In mid-September 1814, when the British forces left the Chesapeake Bay following their failure to take Baltimore and subdue Fort McHenry, they sailed to Jamaica to rendezvous with additional troops fresh from the Napoleonic Wars in Europe for an attack on the American Gulf Coast. In preparation for that attack, a British party of 100 under Major Edward Nichols had occupied Pensacola in Spanish Florida in August with the tacit approval of the local Spanish authorities. He was to establish a base there to arm and train Native American tribes as potential allies and to gain access to an overland approach to attack New Orleans. The year before, in 1813, Congress declared Mobile, 50 miles to the west, to be American territory, and Colonel John Boyer was sent to build a fort to protect it. Major William Lawrence was in command there in September 1814 with 120 men when the British, under Major Nichols, now based in Pensacola, led a joint land-sea attack on it. In spite of superior force, 130 Royal British Marines, 100 Spanish infantry, and 600 Native American warriors, the British failed to take Fort Boyer and in the process lost one of its 4 ships with another severely damaged and suffered 10 times the American loss of 8 killed and wounded. Jackson was determined to eliminate the British menace in Pensacola, so in early November he led over 4,000 troops to the town and demanded the Spanish governor allow the Americans to replace the British until Spanish troops could protect the town. The governor refused, but surrendered quickly when the Americans began to attack. Meanwhile, the British blew their fortifications and disembarked on their ships. Then Jackson set out for Mobile, believing the British were going to attack there, but received an urgent request to hasten to New Orleans, the real target of the British attack. General Wilkinson had been in charge of New Orleans, but his corrupt and inept ways forced his superiors to move him to the Northern Theater, where his responsibility, and the damage he could do, would be limited. On December 1st, Jackson arrived in New Orleans and found the city, with the largest population in the West, 25,000, ill-prepared to defend itself, and the people with no will to do so. With energy and natural command that he was already known for, the general established land and sea defenses, enlisted militia locally and as far away as Tennessee, and welcomed into service backwoodsmen, Native Americans who had been with him, free blacks, and even a powerful group of Baratarian pirates whose base in Grand Terre Island had just been destroyed by the U.S. Navy a couple of months before. He imposed iron discipline, both in his motley military assemblage as well as in the city, a task made easy by his dynamic leadership and the evident devotion of his troops, as well as by the urgency of imminent attack by a massive, well-seasoned, and highly professional British force that began to arrive just over a week after Jackson. With the overland route cut off by General Jackson's attack on Pensacola and the American defenses on Mobile, the British, under Vice Admiral Cochrane and Major General Edward Pakenham, the famous General Wellington's brother-in-law, settled on a sea route to attack New Orleans. By December 13th, the main force had arrived off Cat Island, a barrier island off the coast about 80 miles from the city. 29-year-old U.S. Navy Lieutenant Daniel Patterson, the master commandant in command of the New Orleans squadron, anticipated the British arrival and had assembled available vessels to thwart, or at least delay, the British approach to the city. He placed Lieutenant Thomas App, Welsh for son of, Capsby Jones, in charge of a flotilla of 5 gunboats U.S. gunboats number 5, 23, 156, 162, and 163, the U.S. schooner Seahorse under Sailing Master William Johnson, and the U.S. sloops of war Alligator and Tickler, a force of 245 men armed with 16 long guns and 14 carronades and an assortment of other weapons. Jones positioned his small fleet of gunboats on Lake Bourne so as to block the entrance to Lake Pontchartrain and the city. Determined to eliminate this American force, Admiral Cochrane put Commander Nicholas Lockyer of the H.M. brig Sophie, 18, in command of a fleet of 45 ship's boats, longboats, barges, and launches, with an assortment of cannon and 1,200 Royal Navy sailors and Marines from 14 ships, including the HMS Romilly's 74 that had been active in Long Island Sound and in the Chesapeake. They set sail on the night of December 12th, and en route encountered the U.S. schooner Seahorse, briefly engaged her, but left her under the protection of a shore battery. The Americans subsequently burned her to keep her out of British hands. The British flotilla continued rowing for another day, reaching the Americans on the morning of December 14th, but in the process, 2 British boats were cut off and captured by the Alligator. Then Commander Lockyer organized his boats into 3 attacking units and took command of the leading one. The Americans anchored their 5 gunboats so as to have their broadsides facing the oncoming enemy. They knew their strength was their cannon range, and that, once the British closed, they would be greatly outnumbered, and even though they had hung their boarding nets, it would be only a matter of time that a force of 1,200 would overrun the estimated 130 on the gunboats. Such was the case, and Lockyer expedited the process by going after the American flagship, Lieutenant Jones' U.S. gunboat number 156, armed with a long 24-pounder and 4 12-pounder carronades. After desperate hand-to-hand fighting, during which both Jones and Lockyer were seriously wounded, the British took the vessel and then turned its guns against the remaining 4 American gunboats. In 5 minutes, the fight was over. The U.S. sloop of war Tickler remained out of the action as ordered by Jones, but her skipper scuttled her to keep her out of the hands of the British. The Americans lost 6 killed, 35 wounded, and 86 captured, as opposed to the British loss of 17 killed and 77 wounded. The way was clear to mount the attack on New Orleans. British Major General John Keane established a garrison on Pea Island, about 30 miles from the city, and landed thousands of soldiers in the first wave of British transports. Additional soldiers would arrive from Europe later. News of the defeat on Lake Bourne caused panic in New Orleans, prompting General Jackson to tighten his grip further and declare martial law. 9 days later, on December 23rd, General Keane initiated the attack, marching 1,800 of his men north along the east bank of the Mississippi and camped 9 miles south of the city. Had he continued, the outcome would have been different, for no defenses would have blocked him from the city. But he camped at Villiers Plantation to await reinforcements before proceeding. Having learned about the British movement, Jackson vowed no British soldier would sleep on American soil that night and hastened around 2,000 troops to the British camp. The U.S. Navy initiated the surprise attack. The U.S. sloops of war Louisiana, 16, most of which were 24-pounders, under Lieutenant Charles C.B. Thompson, and Carolina, 14, under Lieutenant John D. Henley, opened up a barrage on the camp in the early evening. Then, Jackson's troops attacked from different quarters. In the darkness, under chaos and confusion, both sides suffered, the British losing 46 killed and over 230 wounded or missing, while Jackson lost 24 killed and about 190 wounded or missing. Jackson fell back to the Rodriguez Canal, a natural line of defense about 4 miles south of the city, and began to fortify it. Each hour the British delayed their advance, Jackson used to strengthen his defenses. General Keane and his fellow officers had high expectations that their battle-hardened troops, fresh from the Napoleonic Wars, would easily deal with the poorly trained local militia and anything else the Americans might throw their way. So, they were doubly surprised by the effective attack. Suddenly more cautious, and with the debate raging within their camp between the Army and the Navy as how to proceed, the British stayed encamped. The American earthen fortifications ran along the north side of the canal from the Mississippi River in the west to a swamp in the east. To protect the Mississippi River flank, Jackson had placed a few hundred men with cannon on the west bank of the river. Both sides continued to strengthen their positions with artillery, the Americans bringing some of their naval guns, while the Louisiana and Carolina continued to bombard the British from the river. To put an end to this, the British set up a furnace for hot shot and returned fire, successfully torching the Carolina until she exploded and forcing the crew of the Louisiana to tow her out of range. On the 28th, the British sent out a large reconnaissance party, and on New Year's Day, the British initiated an artillery duel that lasted 3 hours until they ran out of ammunition or their guns dismounted. The two sides suffered about 100 casualties, mostly British. Rather than launching an attack at that point, General Pakenham, who had come to the front to take command, decided to wait for the full complement of his over 7,000 troops to join him. He was ready 1 week later and launched a two-pronged attack on the morning of January 8, 1815. The British plan called for Colonel William Thornton to lead 600 men across the Mississippi under the cover of darkness to take the American position on the west bank and turn its guns against the Americans' main line of defense on the east side of the river. Then, General Pakenham was to throw his main force of over 5,000 against Jackson's defenses at daybreak. But things did not go as planned. Thornton was delayed until daybreak, but nonetheless did successfully take the west bank, only to be ordered back across the river because the main thrust was delayed. When it was launched, the British had the cover of an unexpected thick ground fog. But just as they approached the American defenses, the fog suddenly lifted, leaving the troops in full view. Cannon, with grape shot and canisters, rifles and muskets, rained devastating sheets of lead on the advancing troops. General Pakenham bravely led his troops riding back and forth, urging them on. He had a horse shot out from under him, mounted another, but was killed by a cannonball. Command fell to Major General John Lambert, who called off the attack and asked for a ceasefire in order to remove the wounded and bury the dead. Jackson agreed. The break gave Lambert time to reflect on the hopelessness of his situation and the extraordinary cost of life were he to resume the battle. So he did not, in spite of the urging by Admiral Cochrane to do so. The admiral was still hopeful that his fleet could sail up the Mississippi, past the American defensive Fort Phillip some 60 miles south of the city, and support the Army in its attack. But Fort Phillip blocked the river in spite of 10 days of continued heavy bombardment. Conceding defeat, the British embarked and sailed east to attack Mobile. The whole New Orleans campaign between December 23rd and January 8th cost the British nearly 2,500 men, 20% of whom were captured. The Americans suffered a loss of only 350, including 50 killed and 200 wounded. It was one of the greatest defeats the British Army ever experienced anywhere, and conversely, many viewed it as the greatest victory of the war for the Americans. The British force of 1,400 men, under General Lambert and a naval squadron led by the HMS Vengeur 74 under Captain Tristram R. Ricketts, sailed to attack Mobile. On February 7th, it arrived off Fort Boyer that protected the entrance to Mobile Bay. Over the next 5 days, the British reconnoitered, landed a force to cut off possible reinforcements reaching the fort from the landward side, began building siege batteries, and brought naval guns on shore. All the while, the 375 Americans in the fort continued to fire on the British when possible, When the British battery was in place, it announced its presence with a barrage, and Captain William Lawrence, commander of the Americans, surrendered in view of the overwhelming force. Although an easy victory, especially compared to the hard-fought battle at New Orleans, it was hollow, for word arrived of the Treaty of Ghent. The British never got to Mobile, but disembarked. The war on brown water was over.
This is a production of the American Society of Marine Artists, the nation's leading professional, educational, not-for-profit marine art organization, made possible with the assistance of the United States Navy, United States Marines, and the United States Coast Guard, in conjunction with other leading national and international institutions, museums, and historical societies.